Hi, I'm Kenneth Sewell, Vice President for Research at Oklahoma State University, welcoming you to this month's edition of OSU Research on Tap. Each month, I sit down with an OSU scientist, artist, or scholar for an informal chat in front of a live audience at Stillwater's Iron Monk Brewery. This is a great way to get a glimpse into the fascinating research these talented individuals carry out at OSU. I hope you enjoy this edition and tune back in each month for a new one. Cheers. Well, welcome everyone. Feel free to continue doing the business of a pub. This is a tap room, so grab a beer. Listen to us if you're interested. Continue chatting amongst yourselves otherwise, but I want to welcome you to this month's edition of OSU Research on Tap. So I'm Kenneth Sewell, the Vice President for Research at Oklahoma State University, and I'm joined today by friend and colleague Arvind Santhanakrishnan. I think I got
That's
close
correct.
to your name. He is from our Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, and we're going to have a little chat about flying and swimming in sticky situations. Talk a little bit about how bio-inspired robotics can inform biology. So help me welcome Dr. Arvind Santhanakrishnan today. Now, Arvind, I know that you're in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering.
Yep.
But would you describe your specific discipline and what got you into this field?
I think if I had to pick a name, it would be bioengineering.
Bioengineering?
Right. So it's a combination of some ideas from biology with some ideas from engineering. A lot of things that I do use engineering techniques, engineering principles, but to study biology. And also sort of go back and give back to engineering
Gotcha.
in the way of devices and so forth. What got me into it was my graduate school. During my doctorate education, I was happy doing a lot of work that was more aerospace tailored, drones and so forth. But I've always been curious about biology since I was little, and it was sort of a way for me to reinvent myself and put myself in an uncomfortable situation where I could be possibly the stupidest person in the room, but still learn a lot. So it felt like a student all the time.
Gotcha. All right. Now, your title had us flying and swimming, and we're going to circle back to the swimming in a little bit. But let's start with flying insects. Maybe the best question for me to start with is, what is a thrip? Thrip? Spell it for us.
THRIPS.
What is a thrip? What are thrips? And what makes it particularly interesting to you as a bioengineer?
Sure.
Thrip. I said it wrong. Thrip.
So thrips are basically smaller than the no-see-ms that you hear of, the gnats, and definitely, I'd say more than 50, 60 times smaller than a fruit fly.
50 or 60 times smaller than a fruit fly.
So
Okay.
like the size of a sand grain, right?
Okay.
So 1/2 millimeter, if that makes any sense. So it's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
small to notice, even harder to follow them, and they fly or hop around. And so what got me into it was mainly, I was looking at a lot of things happening in the larger scale as an engineer, as a mechanical engineer. And I'd sort of taken to granted that when I made things smaller, I watched a lot of James Bond movies, so when James Bond hits a button, something bigger becomes something smaller, and all the cool stuff happens.
Yeah.
So I automatically thought that, bigger to smaller, that would be a very easy jump. Turns out they do completely different stuff in the way they flap their wings than, say, something as big as a dragonfly or slightly bigger as a fruit fly.
So a thrip flies, but it flies fundamentally different than a fruit fly?
Right, so they both flap their wings when they fly, but the fact that the thrips, their size is so small, they have to face a lot of different difficulties that maybe not that common in, say, a much larger insect, like butterfly or dragonfly, for example, because everybody's seen here dragonflies and
Gotcha.
butterflies, right? So, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that if you think you're flying in air, and suddenly you're the equivalent would be to fly in molasses, right? So like trying to fly and swim in something that's sticky that's the type of resistance they face. Because they're so small, they have to put a lot of work into
So the
trying to navigate.
molecules that comprise the air are just larger in reference to the size of the insect itself.
In the sense that just because they're so small, you're going to have to put a lot more power, your muscles, to be able to move your wings. There's just so much more resistance from the air around you.
So you're making a blown up sized robot
Yep.
that is attempting to mimic the flying pattern of a thrip. Is that?
That's right.
That's what
That's
you
right.
do?
Because it's very hard to study them. One of the challenges that
Yeah, I want to know, why don't you just bring the thrip in and put it under a
Right,
microscope
right.
and
Yeah,
study?
that would be
Yeah.
wonderful, right? Yeah, but the problem is that given that they're so small, that's one challenge. You got to really magnify, all these fancy cameras that we're recording here, you got to really be able to magnify and see something that small size. But the kicker here is that they also flap their wings like 200 times a second.
200 times a second.
Right, so kind of like, what you would think of like a hummingbird, for example, but it's a very small sized, essentially a little dirt particle, right? That's flapping its wings so fast. So if you think about magnifying your camera, you're also going to have to record really fast, like a very slow motion type recording, because you got to capture what their wings are doing. And the problem with that is you can't get a lot of light because you're trying to shutter your camera so fast to get that slow motion recording, and so you don't have enough light. So when you magnify, you need a lot of light, and then you obviously can't control what they're doing. So they may just, when all is said and done, we're like, my student and I were like, oh yeah, well let's go study how this thing flies. We put it in the lab and it just sits there for hours and it's not wanting to move. What do you do then, right? So,
Well, we'll come back to the robot here, but help us understand what these kinds of insects, what function they're performing in the ecosystem.
sure,
Yeah.
they're even though they're so small that you can't see them and they're hopping or walking, flying, whatever they're doing, they do significant. They play a very significant role in the agricultural sphere, because if you think about a lot of the damage that you see in produce like tomatoes or peppers, where you've got dents in them, they've sort of started rotting away. A lot of times these are the insects that when they're feeding on nectar, they're transmitting viruses that spread these diseases. And since it's so hard to understand how they move, it's very hard to control them other than using just a massive pesticide of some sort. It's very hard to understand how do we targetedly sort of go after and terminate them or control them.
If you can understand their movement, you can better manage the potential risks.
That's right. And if you think about like organic farming, you can't just go and massively sort of spray chemicals. And so then what do you do? How do you control them? You need to understand how the animal moves, right, in the natural environment.
So we're going to get to the robots in just a second, but
Sure.
So since they're so different, and you say they're flapping their wings, but what have they evolved as far as their body type and the wings and so forth that allows them to fly in molasses, to fly in this sticky situation?
That's one of the most interesting things. So most insects that are smaller than fruit fly, and everybody is seeing fruit flies, in the summer, you put out a banana for more than a couple of days and you forget about it. You have all these fruit flies sitting around it. Most insects that are smaller than fruit fly, and I say most because biology surprises us in ways that we don't even imagine. Suddenly there will be some interesting creature that nobody's thought of or seen or whatnot. But most insects that are flying smaller than a fruit fly, their wings don't look as solid. They actually tend to have more hairs or bristles.
Hairs or bristles on the wings themselves.
Right. And so an alternative title that I've used for stuff like this is hairy situation as well.
Hairy situation.
Right. Which when I show up and it's a hairy situation, they think it's something else, so I avoid that. So.
Well, I won't at all get into why you've chosen to have hair the way you have hair, but do you have a theory as to why these tiny insects, why they've evolved these hairs on their
So what's
wings?
interesting is that when they flap their wings, what they do is they bring their wings on top of their head really close together, almost like clapping their wings on top of their head.
So they're doing jumping jacks almost.
Kind of like
isn't it?
that,
Yeah.
right. And a big, like birds will do this. Like pigeons, if you try to shoo them away, they'll take off, they'll freak out, and they'll sort of flap their wings, and you'll hear them clapping. You'll hear the, you can sort of hear that, right? When you think about this. But they only do it when you sort of scare them. Butterflies will do it if you catch them. And when I was little, I'd catch them, put it on a coat hanger, and sort of watch what they're doing, right? Cruel stuff. But all kids do it, right? But these guys do it just free flight. They'll do that, right? And now the challenge is that now I take 2 little plates, right, and I put them in water, and I stick them together, and I try to push them apart. I'll see a little bit of stickiness, right? Now I replace the glass of water with honey, just to kind of give you that effect of increasing resistance to the fluid around you. And it's going to be much more harder. You'll actually feel this tension, right? You can't just easily peel them off. So what's interesting is that on the one hand, they do this, it's sort of, that's what they do when they flap their wings. On the other hand, it is not so easy for them to do that. So what these hairs are doing on their wings is basically sort of leaking some of this flow through them. So again, now think about those plates, poke a bunch of holes in them and put them in honey and try to peel them apart. It'll be a lot more easier.
Much easier.
So it's sort of like that.
Okay. So I'm a student in your lab, and we're going to build a thrip-like model, robot. How do we go about doing that?
A lot of things. So the first thing is to watch the biological organism in full form, right? So see what the animal does in no sort of controlled circumstances if you can. And so we have been fortunate to collaborate with biologists in University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I was at a long time ago. And they've been able to get really nice recordings, very slow motion recordings, only select cases, but they've been able to get recordings of this. So, as a student, you'd watch these recordings and you'd sort of kind of deconstruct all the different things that they're doing into more simpler motion profiles, patterns, right? And now we got to go to the mechanical engineering aspect of this work and sort of think of a way to mechanize that, right? So if I were to go and cut a couple of plates with like plexiglass or plastic or whatever, or 3D print them, whatever I'm doing, how do I fit them onto something and make them execute pieces of that motion?
Pieces of the motion.
Right. Start simple and not necessarily trying to recreate the whole animal. Again, I'm not Frankenstein, I'm not trying, I'm not Dr. Frankenstein, right? So it's not trying to create the whole thing in one shot, but sort of doing it in little pieces, and then eventually we'll sort of try and integrate it and get the whole sort of motion pattern.
Gotcha. So just curious, does the robot end up looking like the thrip?
No.
No.
I don't show pictures to people because it looks scarier.
Yeah. So the point is to robotize the motion of the flight.
That's right.
Not to robotize the organism itself.
That's right. So when you look at the actual model, the stuff that we don't actually show, there's gears, there's nuts and bolts, there's rack and pinion, all sorts of fun stuff that undergraduates in mechanical engineering learn, maybe in their junior year or senior year.
Yeah.
So very basic engineering components that are sort of put together, and we use computer-aided design to sort of put them together virtually to make sure we're not making any silly mistakes, so we don't spend a lot of money. And so a lot of stuff is just very basic hardcore engineering in terms of how this model gets built.
So who winds up caring about this? And by that I mean, what directions do the knowledge you gain from building the robot and understanding that flight motion, does it only help the farmers? Does it only help the biologists who are interested in really understanding the basic mechanisms? Where are the implications?
I think one of the things I was trying to say before is that the sort of the robotic models that we're building and using in my lab, we're using them to study some fundamental questions that can be helpful for understanding the biology a little bit more, the mechanics especially. but also we can kind of give back to the engineering community in that a lot of the, there's a whole type of, flying like aerial drones called micro air vehicles or micro aerial vehicles. And so the goal here is to miniaturize the size of the drone that's basically remotely operated or.
So we obviously
radio
have drones
controlled.
that are as big as full-size airplanes.
Right.
We've all seen the drones that you can fit in a briefcase.
Right.
So how small are these?
So there's work out there where they've tried to miniaturize it to the size of maybe 1 or 2 pennies, that size. The main challenge is that you can't fit a huge engine or a battery pack
The
into
power
these things.
supply becomes the
Very challenging.
Yeah.
So the longest flight that you can see from these continuous flight is no more than 5-6 minutes.
Right.
Right? And a lot of these, they try to mimic the flapping mechanism, but they don't necessarily concentrate, for example, on the wing design itself, or the type of flapping mechanism. They sort of just flap them about, just like what you would picture in a cartoon or whatnot.
Yeah.
But the nuances are not necessarily looked into. And so what we're thinking is that if we can even improve that capability by using some of this wing design type ideas into the robotic, the drone, that realm, then maybe we would be able to use the same amount of power, but maybe hover a little bit longer.
Yep, gotcha. So the old saying of, I'd like to be a fly on the wall. One of these days we might be able to be a fly on the wall with drone technology.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Now let's turn back to the swimmers. So
Sure.
It took me a while to even know how to spell a thrip, let alone picture one in my head. But when you're talking about these sticky situations for miniature swimmers, what kinds of animals are we talking about there?
So when you think about swimmers, I mean, everybody can picture, the first thing most people picture is fish, right?
Sure.
Shark, fish, whale. We all go to aquariums, we see the big guys. They're just amazing in what they do, and they're just so easy to appreciate, and they're just big and great, and so we appreciate them. And when you look at small, people may be able to even think of bacteria, for example, right? They're kind of propagating in our bloodstream and so forth. What I'm looking at is the class of size that's sort of in between. So it's neither here nor there. So it's not as big as a whale or a shark or a guppy or whatever
Carp
size
or
you're thinking
whatever,
of.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
not as small as a bacterium. It's sort of in between. It's in the scale where you can sort of see them, but you really don't know what sort of tricks they're using to, again, sort of swim in that sticky situation that I'm referring to.
Okay. So what's a couple of examples of those?
So you think about shrimp.
Shrimp.
That's a pretty good example. There's a whole range of varieties
Yep.
of sizes. Krill, that's another example. They're massive. So the number of krill in a school in the Antarctic, for example, in the ocean, is just huge, right? So they actually create a huge effect to the environment. But since each of them are sort of not that big, we don't necessarily pay attention to them as much.
So what's their? We all have an image of a fish and how a fish moves.
Right.
I've certainly seen a lot of shrimp and eaten a lot of
On a
shrimp.
plate, right.
But how do they move around and what's interesting?
So
from your
they've got
perspective?
they basically do they paddle set of legs near their tail. And so it's kind of like a doggy paddle, sort of
Only
like that.
with more than 4 legs. like the
Yeah,
dog
so
has.
they have like something like 4 to 5 or even more pairs of these legs that they sort of paddle. What's interesting is that unlike rowing, so that's the sort of the most tangible example I can think of is rowing. Everybody's again seeing teams of rowers, Olympics.
So we're coordinated.
Yeah, so they're coordinated. Here they actually do a little bit something different. So it's sort of like a football stadium wave where they actually don't go all in coordination. One of the paddles or legs are going to sort of wait for the other. And so they do some sort of weird rhythm that helps them to move in that condition a little bit more easier.
So when you're robotizing this,
Right.
you're not just robotizing the motion, you're also trying to get that whole coordination figured out.
Right. So and the nice thing about the robotic model is that you can do both. You can do both. You can do what the animals don't do, which you can't teach a shrimp to row, right? In the way you want it.
But you can make the robot row
That's right.
and see if it moves faster, slower.
That's right, right. So that allows us to sort of compare and see, you know, in that size scale that we're looking at, is it just more advantageous for you to move that way? That's sort of the question we can ask.
All right, so with the flyers, you've got the implications for the biology of those animals and the implication for the drones. What about with the swimmers? Got the biological direction? What's the engineering that feed forward, giving back to the engineers, as you said, with the swimmers?
So the biology aspect is pretty incredible because we understand a lot about you know, with a lot of research, we've been able to understand how fishes move, especially when they develop or are in different environmental conditions, you know, different types of fishes and so forth. What fishes usually feed are on these types of creatures. And so knowing how their prey sort of move can affect commercial fish populations and their, and so it has a pretty big consequence because of that. So understanding the motion patterns of these shrimp and krill, for example, which are being ingested by a lot of these bigger fish, which we tend to eat, that's going to have a lot of impact in the ecosystem.
Right.
And the engineering aspect is that, so if you think about most people have seen the Malaysian Airlines, the aircraft that crashed in the Indian Ocean. We can't really find out what happened and so forth. They deployed these underwater, basically unmanned drones.
So we talk a lot about unmanned aerial vehicles,
right?
But
these are basically underwater drones.
Unmanned underwater vehicles.
Like a big canister with some sort of like a propeller in the back, like a fan in the back, and these vehicles are fairly big. And I think the cost of deploying each time was like $1 million, and it came out unsuccessful because it's a pretty big size vehicle. It can't really navigate that quickly and sort of enlarge the search space and so forth. If you're able to sort of miniaturize the size of this, potentially you could cut the cost down and you could deploy a swarm of them, like a swarm of robotic krill, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And go and ask them to search for, you know, mines that are buried in the ocean, wrecks of potentially really big hazards, monitoring construction of like oil rigs or whatnot.
So
right?
essentially sensors that can swim.
That's right.
Yep.
And the and one of the things that's missing right now in the commercial sort of underwater drones space is a lot of them rely on just one main source of motion. So a lot of them have this sort of propeller in the back that thrusts and sort of goes where you want it to. Whereas with a mechanism like the shrimp or the krill, you've got more than one knob to tweak in that you can change the way each of them move relative to the other. You could cut down one and use the rest. There's just a little bit more freedom.
If the propeller hits something and knocks off a blade, it's pretty much dead in the water, literally.
So now you can have some tolerance to accidents
like
that.
Yeah. So I want to know where you think this is all going in your lab next. Like, what's the next frontier for the Santhanakrishnan lab?
That sounds pretty intense.
That sounds intense. I had to type all those letters to get it on here.
Yeah. Okay. You should have copied and pasted.
I should have copied and pasted.
I think a couple of directions, and I think again, to sort of both the engineering and the biology realm. So one of the things that we're starting to look at is so the aquatic organisms that I'm talking about, the shrimp and the krill, and there's mantis shrimp and all sorts of creatures. And so they display quite a bit of quick maneuvering skills. So we're sort of starting to look into how they're able to accomplish that. So in a short time, you're able to sort of climb, you're able to move fast forward and sort of turn and move away from your threat. And so again, this is something that we don't really understand how they do it, partly because they're very small, and again, it's a little bit difficult to control their position, how they orient themselves in a freely swimming animal. So these are things that we want to explore. And eventually what we want to get to is sort of large groups, how they swim. Obviously, we're not going to build like thousands and thousands of krill robots sounds fascinating to me, but
Yeah,
I don't think I'll get money to do that.
You won't get the funding to build thousands of them, right?
But being able to do even a few of them. So one of the things that we're interested in exploring is that there's climatic patterns that create a lot of oceanic circulation and sort of churn the ocean in a very general sense. Krill, for example, they swim in these huge schools, right? Long distances, very big schools. And what they're doing, and when they're swimming, is they're sort of bringing heavier water and lighter water in their non-preferred height levels. And so one of the hypotheses that we want to look and see is whether they generate some sort of larger scale circulation in the ocean. And so this has a pretty big...
together it creates that churn.
Right. So think of a very large school, thousands and thousands of these. Are they able to actually bring... Because you think about salt water, right? Because these are all marine organisms.
Yeah.
You've got heavier water, lighter water. And so if you sort of lopside that, right? So you pour salt water on top of your beer, shouldn't do that. It'll taste awful. But if you were to, then it's going to sink down, right? So if you're able to create this sort of churning effect, you're able to sort of create some larger scale circulation in the ocean. And so what sort of impact does that have?
So that's one of the next frontiers.
Right. And the vehicle, the robotic realm, I'm sort of interested in obviously making a drone prototype of this. And in addition, I want to look at how they switch from walking. A lot of these are bottom dwellers, so how they switch from walking to swimming pretty seamlessly, which again, a lot of our drones that exist in commercial space, they're not able to accomplish that with that seamlessly.
So I think you called that multimodal
transportation.
Multimodal. Yeah. So the same way with maybe an unmanned aero vehicle that lands on the ground and then being able to use the same apparatus from one motive.
It's the whole James Bond motivation, right? Yeah. I hit a button, I can drive a car. Hit a button, I can fly. I can go underwater, right?
Fantastic. Okay. Fascinating stuff. Well, I've gotten to have all this fun up here talking with Arvind. So now it's your turn. So we have the famous microphone ball. So we are on O State TV, and we do want not only for Arvind to hear your question so he can respond to it, but also we want our people who are joining us by O State TV to be able to hear it. So please request the wonderful ball if you would like to ask a question. So who's up? We got a question back here.
Okay, so your comment about like the krill or whatever, looking at the effect of the ocean, can they turn the water over? Really interesting. But that's an ecosystem. Don't you have to consider, a pod of killer whales coming across, what counterbalance they're going to have?
Absolutely, right. So, and again, I think you know this, right? So we start simple, we try to approximate some of the more realistic features in order for us to even rule out whether this idea, this hypothesis is even valuable or not. And then you obviously introduce the more relevant conditions in that ocean environment.
Question back here?
Hi, Ryan Durden. What the more interesting propulsion mechanisms you've seen in underwater organisms?
So there's a whole host of them, and what's unclear is where you get the cutoff from one to the other, right? So I think there's undulation, like worms, for example. They can undulate and move. Lampreys are another example. There's the fin-based locomotion that you see in fishes. There's the sort of walking to paddling that these guys, the crustaceans or the shrimp, krill, lobster, all these guys do. There's really strange ones too. So my collaborator at Georgia Tech, they found this Antarctic creature that does pretty much a whole lot. So it can actually adjust its density and roll, sink, or sort of levitate itself. Has wings that flap like an insect, kind of like the aerial version that I was talking about earlier. So all of that in this probably a few millimeters in size, right? So it's pretty remarkable to sort of not only have been able to sort of overcome the resistance you face when you're so small in the water, but also to be able to sort of stagger all these hierarchical propulsion techniques into a platform that's very small, right? So there's quite a bit of range of modalities out there.
Other questions?
Can you hear it? Okay, here we
Yep.
go. So you talked about like how it might impact like or something like that. Have you been approached about any commercial applications regarding your research?
Not yet. No. If you're interested, I'd be happy to talk to you. No, not yet. But I think so translating fundamental research is not so easy because the two worlds don't really talk. And I think events like this probably will help. We need to do more, like all the time. But I think the challenge is that unless, so I think a lot of the blame is on my side because I don't necessarily have to go outside my comfort zone and explain what this application could be. And so I think that's sort of the barrier I'm trying to break.
Okay, so I've got a question that relates to education. You're studying some very interesting things, but they seem very fundamental. So whenever you have a class, you're talking about your very small things and how sticky things become at small levels, and then you talk about the ocean. We know that penguins fly in the water. So do you translate that into fluid dynamics whenever you're doing your classes?
Yes, I think so. I've actually done this demonstration, so you can get it. I guess Toys R Us is probably extinct now. I should probably go and get more of these. But you can get these very small fish toys that basically have a battery fitted in them. You just drop them in water and they'll move. And so what I do is I put them in a fish tank that's got water, and then I put them in a tank that's got something more stickier, like glycerin or whatever. I haven't tried honey because I think I'd want to drink it. But basically you'll see that they can't move. And so this is something I've even been able to do to middle school kids in Oklahoma City. And I think it sort of naturally raises the question why, right? So we all have a really childhood curiosity that we lose at some point because we have to have a paying job, pay bills, all the boring stuff. But if you sort of go to your inner child, you're going to be like, why is that, right? And so that's when I start to ask them, what's different about this guy? And so they'll actually put their hands in and they'll say, oh, it's yucky, it's very sticky. And so then I try to make those connections between, the size is the same, now the fluid is a little bit stickier. Now I could keep the same water, but now I could make the fish like 1,000 times smaller, and it's going to just be flopping around, it cannot move. So.
So in the beginning of your talk, you had mentioned that, from watching a lot of James Bond movies, it's easy to think if something's this big and you make it small, it's going to work the same way. So what does that mean if you take a tiny organism and make a robot to mimic it, but it's, you can see it, touch it, pick it up? Is it going to fly? Is it going to fly or swim the same way?
So if I'm understanding you right, you're asking the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Going from small to big.
So can you really learn something
Yeah,
from that
so
robot?
that's a
they're
really
gonna be
good
the
question.
same.
It's almost like you're like a planted questioner. You asked a really good question here, right?
We didn't plant her, I
No, I
promise.
know, I'm joking. It's a really good question because I think you have to be very careful in going from the small to the large and vice versa. So what we do is we try to match some physical quantities that allow us to sort of make the claim that the type of forces that the small guy will experience would be similar, not the same, but similar in the larger.
Similar in scale.
Similar in scale to the larger one. So that allows us to kind of go back and forth between the two realms. It is very challenging because what we find is a lot of these intricate features, we cannot match those. So a lot of times when we try to say I've matched sort of the scales, you're going to ask which scale. Are you talking about the body? Are you talking about the wing? Are you talking about the hairs in the wing?
Right.
And it's very difficult to match all of them at the same time. So, because to me it comes down to having, I think, like a 2-ton tank of like corn syrup, right? And I can't afford to do that. And my department head won't give me the space, I think, to do something like that, right? Because the safety concerns are just going to be like out
As
of whack.
he looks at
right?
his department head, that was good.
I'm just putting a plug in, right? I need more space, right? So, but anyway, so yeah, you do have to consider it. It's a very good question. That's the kind of stuff that I talk in my undergraduate class in fluid dynamics or fluid mechanics. So.
I have another one. So you talked about the motion, and then you mentioned like flight time or the battery storage of the devices only being 5 to 6 minutes. Will your research stop there, or will you also go on to like explore like potential payloads?
I think yes, that would be ideal. I don't think working with not a realistic payload with cameras or whatever sensors I think it would sort of defeat the purpose. We would probably start by not worrying about the electronic integration, maybe just putting dead weights, to sort of simulate that effect. But I think it would require us to collaborate with a whole host of people that don't have the expertise, or have the expertise that I don't have. That's what I meant. So for example, there's sophistication in materials that we'll need to look into. There's sophistication in the electronics that we need to look into, the control of that device or the vehicle. And so it's going to require us to sort of go and talk to a bunch of people, which that can always be interesting, right?
One more question.
All right. So,
Yeah.
Just hold it still and you're good.
all right, with smaller bacteria that have the little cilia, the flagella, they're
Right.
used for sensing, right?
Right.
So, is there a way you could scale that up? So, on your bigger model that you make, for those subtle, fine changes in air compression or something else, that could translate to more efficient flying.
So in a previous job in North Carolina, I looked at that exact question. So I looked at a lot of ulcers caused by this Helicobacter pylori, this bacteria that swims in your gut. And so we made a physical model of that was scaled up, and we weren't able to replicate some of the patterns. And so I think a challenge is that at some point, when you make this bigger thing smaller, they don't work the same way. And so there's this very sharp cutoff. So in the flying realm, so if you look at these miniature insects that I'm talking about, millimeter or smaller, when they get so small that there's actually these groups of insects that we've still been unsuccessful in trying to get. They're called fairy flies because it's like a mythological thing, but they really exist, and there's thousands and thousands of them. But they can actually fly and swim using the same type of wing beat patterns and so forth.
Wow.
And they're very hard to get. But after that or below that, you'll find that mechanism is no longer present. What you'll see is spiders, like little baby spiders, they'll start ballooning. So they'll throw out their threads, and they'll sort of just glide through, whatever distance they're going to make. So, and then even below, you'll see this corkscrew type, like flagellated bacteria and so forth. So there's clearly some cutoff points, right? And that's another driving question of this research are these insects really operating at the cutoff point? And what tricks, both in the structure, their wings and so forth, and the way they move their wing, the dynamics, so to say, how are they playing tricks to be able to even make that happen? Because if I make a drone that small, just for the sake of imagination, if I can't replicate those mechanisms, then it was going to be very difficult for me to fly.
To fly and to have any kind of power
That's
ratio
right.
to the
Right.
duration.
Right.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to have a little bit of time perhaps afterwards for
Yeah.
mingling and
Yeah.
more questions, but
I'll be around.
I want to stick to our timeline. But please join me in thanking Arvind Santhanakrishnan for talking to us.
Thank you.
And we have our traditional OSU Research on Tap speaker gift, which is a medallion that you can go around your head there, and it
Yeah. includes,
I'll try not to mess with your microphone very much, a bottle opener there on the medallion.
Oh.
So
So if you guys have a problem finding me, I'll be walking around with this. Because he's agreed to pay for my beers.
It's on my tab. So the last thing I want to say before we have our parting toast is that our next Research on Tap, I mentioned during the announcements, it'd be right here on May 21st, but I didn't tell you who it was going to be. You know, we have that old saying of the person who doesn't understand history is destined to repeat it. Well, we have Dr. Holly Carabeau is going to be joining us from the Department of History, and we're going to discuss a question of treat the illness or punish the crime, a history of drug use and addiction in America. Really interesting topic and a really interesting mode of scholarship and research, a little bit far afield from what we've been doing today with engineering. So come back and join us next month. But I'd like to finish with our toast, a little homage to the National Science Foundation's 2 criteria. May your intellect be meritorious and your impact be broad.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks, guys. Join us next month.